Somewhere in the mythology of war, there exists a version of history where battles are won by brilliant men making brilliant decisions, where generals study maps, identify weaknesses, and execute flawless maneuvers that shatter the enemy with surgical precision. That version of history is more comfortable than the real one. The real one involves a Confederate general ordering his soldiers back into certain defeat after they had already broken free. It involves a Union scout who mistook a row of trees for an enemy encampment and sent hundreds of men to their deaths along a river they could barely cross. It involves the largest battle of the entire Civil War starting because a division commander wanted shoes. These are not footnotes. They shaped the arc of the conflict. Some of these accidents handed entire campaigns to one side or the other. Some of them killed tens of thousands of men who might have lived, if not for a single failure of nerve, a single false report, or a single piece of paper left lying in a field. The Civil War is full of moments where history tilted on something absurd. What follows are 10 of the most consequential.
On the night of October 20th, 1861, a Union officer named Colonel Charles Devens sent a reconnaissance patrol across the Potomac River near Leesburg, Virginia. The scout came back with a report. There was a Confederate encampment just beyond the tree line, lightly guarded, apparently asleep. There was no encampment. What the scout had seen, squinting through the Virginia darkness, was a line of trees. That misidentification set off one of the most catastrophic small engagements of the war's first year. Devens crossed the river with several hundred men on a handful of flatboats barely large enough to hold them. Other Union regiments followed. They climbed a steep 40-foot bluff on the Virginia side, reached the top, and found nothing. What they found by morning, instead, were Confederate regiments under Nathan Evans, who had been alerted to the crossing and were waiting. If this channel is your kind of history, subscribe. Hit the bell. You already know your stand.
The Union position at Ball's Bluff was untenable from the moment they crested that ridge. There was nowhere to retreat without tumbling back down 40 feet of dirt and scrub into a river they had already struggled to cross. The boats were inadequate. The plan, to the extent one had even existed, had evaporated along with the phantom camp that triggered the whole operation. The Confederates pressed hard. Men fell near the bluff's edge, and those who tried to retreat were shot going over it. Some drowned. Senator Edward Baker, one of the only sitting U.S. senators to die in combat during the war, and a close personal friend of Abraham Lincoln's, was killed on that ridge. Hundreds of Union soldiers were captured or cut down along the riverbank. The Confederate victory at Ball's Bluff required no special competence on their part. It required only that Union commanders trust a scout who saw trees and reported tents.
9 months before Antietam, before the war's great turning points had yet arrived, a different kind of accident decided to fight in Missouri that most people have forgotten. The Union force that marched toward Wilson's Creek on the morning of August 10, 1861, had a plan that looked bold on paper. General Nathaniel Lyon would strike the Confederate camp from the north, while a flanking column under Franz Sigel swung south to hit their rear, catch the Confederates between two fires, and break their hold on the state before it could harden into something permanent. For a short while, it worked. Sigel's flanking column successfully positioned itself below the Confederate camp and opened fire at dawn, driving men back in confusion. Then a regiment in gray approached Sigel's line. Sigel's troops assumed it was friendly. The 3rd Louisiana Infantry was wearing gray, the same shade as many Union forces in the Western Theater, before uniform standards had been enforced. Sigel's artillery held. His infantry held. Officers concluded the approaching regiment was part of Lyon's force, swinging around to link up. The 3rd Louisiana waited.
until the range could not be missed, then opened fire at nearly point-blank distance.
Sigel's entire column dissolved in minutes. His artillery was overrun, his men scattered across the Missouri countryside. The two-pronged attack became a single-pronged attack against a concentrated enemy, and Lyon, fighting without his Southern support and heavily outnumbered, was shot from his horse on the hill that still carries his name today. The first Union general to die in battle during the war. Two armies wore the same color. One side made an assumption. The battle ended before Sigel's troops ever really had a chance to understand what had gone wrong. 6 months into 1862, the Union was beginning to apply real pressure in the Western Theater, and Ulysses Grant had surrounded Fort Donelson, Tennessee, with roughly 27,000 men. Inside the fort, Confederate commanders Gideon Pillow, John Floyd, and Simon Bolivar Buckner held perhaps 12,000. The arithmetic of the situation was obvious to everyone on both sides. On the morning of February 15th, Pillow launched a breakout attack on Grant's right flank. It worked. The Union line buckled. Confederate soldiers were pushing through the gap, and the road to Nashville lay open before them. Buckner and his officers could see it clearly. The escape was happening. The hard part was done. Then Gideon Pillow ordered everyone back inside the fort. His stated reason, that the men needed to collect their gear and supplies before departing, has never been coherently defended, then or since. Grant was away from his headquarters when the breakthrough occurred. The road was open. There was nothing standing between 12,000 Confederate soldiers and their freedom, except the decision to keep moving. By the time Grant returned, assessed the situation, and reorganized his collapsed flank, the Confederates were back inside their earthworks. The window was gone. That night, Pillow and Floyd, both of whom feared federal charges stemming from pre-war service and had no interest in being captured, slipped away by boat with a handful of men and left Buckner to face the music alone. Buckner sent Grant a message requesting terms. Grant's reply became one of the most quoted dispatches in American military history. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. Buckner accepted, and 12,000 Confederate soldiers became prisoners because one general had the escape in his hands and chose to give it back. The most famous accident of the entire war happened in a field near Frederick, Maryland, on September 13, 1862. Two soldiers from the 27th Indiana Infantry were resting on ground recently vacated by Confederate forces when one of them noticed a small bundle lying in the grass. Wrapped around 3 cigars was a piece of paper. It was Special Orders 191, Robert E. Lee's complete operational plan for the Maryland campaign. The position of every Confederate division, their objectives, their routes of march, and the timing of the entire invasion. Someone in Lee's army had dropped it, and now it was in George McClellan's hands. McClellan reportedly told a visiting general that afternoon, "Here is a paper with which if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." He knew where Lee's army was. He knew it was divided. He knew he had the numbers to destroy it in pieces before it could concentrate, if he moved quickly enough. He moved. Slowly, as McClellan always moved, but he moved. His forces pushed through South Mountain, forced Lee to consolidate near Sharpsburg along a creek called Antietam, and on September 17, 1862, fought the bloodiest single day in American military history. Combined casualties approached 23,000 men between sunrise and sunset. The Union did not win a decisive victory. McClellan's habitual caution saw to that. But he forced Lee back across the Potomac, stopped the Confederate invasion of the North, and gave Lincoln the strategic backdrop he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later. a document that transformed the political character of the entire war. All of it traced back to 3 cigars and a Confederate courier who did not secure his orders. Joseph Hooker spent the winter and spring of 1863 rebuilding the Army of the Potomac after its catastrophic defeat at Fredericksburg. And by late April, he had accomplished something real. He marched the bulk of his army west, crossed the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers, and came down behind Lee's position, catching the Confederate Army between Hooker's main force at Chancellorsville and a corps under Sedgwick holding Fredericksburg. Lee was in a genuine vice. On the morning of May 1st, Hooker advanced. His leading corps made contact with Confederate defenders and pushed them back. The momentum was real, the position was strong, and the men were moving. Then, Hooker ordered his army to halt. He pulled his advancing corps back to their starting positions around the Chancellorsville crossroads and instructed his army to entrench. His subordinates, several of whom had been pushing forward and felt confident about their progress, were stunned. Corps Commander Darius Couch later wrote that at the moment he received the order, he knew the battle was effectively over. What seized Hooker at that critical juncture has been argued over for generations. A Confederate artillery round struck a pillar he was leaning against the following day and briefly concussed him, an injury sometimes offered as the explanation. But the retreat from the advance had already been ordered before that shell landed. Most accounts suggest Hooker simply lost his nerve. That the weight of it, the sheer responsibility of putting the whole campaign on the line, collapsed something in him at the exact moment it needed to hold. Lee, who had every reason to be retreating, saw opportunity instead. He and Stonewall Jackson planned a march of Jackson's entire corps around the exposed Union right flank, an audacious gamble that would have been suicidal if Hooker had kept advancing. Jackson's column completed the march unmolested, crashed into Union General Oliver Howard's 11th Corps at dusk on May 2nd, and shattered the Union right. That night, riding ahead of his lines in the dark to scout Union positions, Jackson was fired on by a North Carolina regiment that heard horses approaching and assumed they were Union cavalry. He was struck in multiple places and died 8 days later from pneumonia following the amputation of his arm. Lee won his most celebrated victory. He won it because Hooker stopped moving when he was ahead, and because the general most responsible for the subsequent Confederate success was then killed by his own men in the dark. The battle that defined the war in public memory, the 3 days at Gettysburg that would fill more books than any other event in American history, began because a Confederate division needed shoes. On June 30th, 1863, General Henry Heth asked his corps commander, A.P. Hill, whether he could take his division into the Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg the following morning. Intelligence suggested the town had a supply depot, and Heth's men needed footwear. Hill told him to go ahead, noting there was probably nothing significant in the area. The intelligence was wrong. John Buford's Union cavalry had ridden into Gettysburg the day before. Buford immediately understood that the town sat at the convergence of several major roads, and that the ridge lines to its south, Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, were the kind of elevated ground that would determine the outcome of any large engagement fought in that vicinity. He positioned his dismounted troopers to delay any Confederate approach until infantry could arrive, then sent urgent riders to General John Reynolds. Heth's division marched toward Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st, expecting a supply run. They walked into Buford's cavalry instead. The skirmishing that broke out drew in reinforcements from both sides through the course of the morning, until it had grown beyond anyone's ability to stop or redirect. By the time it ended 3 days later, roughly 51,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing across the fields and ridges south of that town. Pickett's Charge, Little Round Top, the Bloody Angle, the High Water Mark, all of it flowed from the morning of July 1st. Henry Heth went looking for shoes.
he found the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. Let it sit.
By September of 1863, General William Rosecrans had done something genuinely impressive. He had maneuvered the Confederate Army of Tennessee out of Chattanooga without fighting a major battle, using pure operational movement to make Braxton Bragg's position untenable. Then, Confederate reinforcements arrived, including James Longstreet's entire corps, transferred by rail from Virginia, and Bragg turned to fight. The Battle of Chickamauga opened on September 19th in the dense woods along the Georgia-Tennessee border, where visibility was measured in yards, and unit cohesion dissolved almost immediately. By the second day, Rosecrans was managing a complicated defensive line while receiving reports faster than he could properly evaluate them. One report was false. An officer informed Rosecrans that there was a gap in the Union line between the divisions of Wood and Reynolds. There was no gap. The two divisions were in contact with each other. But the report reached Rosecrans at a moment when he was already operating under severe pressure, and he issued an order to General Thomas Wood to close the gap by moving his division to support Reynolds immediately. To comply, Wood had to pull his division out of the line entirely. The weight of that decision.
At the exact moment Wood's men stepped out of position, Longstreet launched a massive assault against that precise section of the front. It was a coincidence so perfectly timed that it seems nearly impossible, but the gap that had not existed minutes before now gaped open, and Longstreet's corps poured through it. The Union Army was torn in two. Half of it, including Rosecrans himself, fled toward Chattanooga in a rout. George Thomas held the other half together on Snodgrass Hill for the remainder of the day, earning a nickname that has followed him through history. The Confederate victory at Chickamauga, the bloodiest engagement in the Western theater, arrived because a staff officer misread the situation, wrote a false report, and a general acted on it at the worst possible moment. After Chickamauga, Bragg's Confederate Army bottled the Union Army of the Cumberland inside Chattanooga, occupying the high ground on all sides and slowly squeezing the city's supply lines into uselessness. Grant arrived, broke the supply problem, and by late November had assembled enough force to go on the offensive against Bragg's position on Missionary Ridge. On November 25, 1863, Grant assigned Thomas's Army of the Cumberland a limited, specific task: capture the Confederate rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge. Those rifle pits were forward positions, lightly held. The main Confederate strength sat at the ridge's crest, several hundred feet above. Thomas's men were meant to take the base, hold it, and relieve pressure while Grant's other forces attacked the Confederate flanks. Thomas's men took the rifle pits in a matter of minutes. Then, without orders from Thomas, without orders from Grant, without orders from anyone, they kept climbing. Individual soldiers started up the slope, then squads, then regiments, then brigades, moving uphill against an entrenched enemy in a charge that no officer above the rank of colonel had authorized. Grant, watching from his command position at Orchard Knob, turned to Thomas and demanded to know who had ordered the assault up the ridge. Thomas said he hadn't. Grant stated that whoever had ordered it would answer for it, if it failed.
The Confederate defenders at the top faced a tactical problem they could not solve in the time they had. The ridge's steep grade prevented them from depressing their artillery low enough to hit the men climbing below. Canister rounds flew overhead. The men coming up the slope were largely veterans of the Army of the Cumberland, men who had been driven off Chickamauga 2 months earlier, with the memory of that defeat still fresh. And they reached the summit and broke the Confederate line before Bragg's commanders could organize any meaningful response. Bragg's army retreated in disorder. The unauthorized, unplanned, spontaneous charge up Missionary Ridge is one of the stranger moments in American military history.
a battle plan that succeeded in spite of itself, because the soldiers ignored it.
The plan at Petersburg in the summer of 1864 was, by any honest assessment, one of the more imaginative ideas of the entire war. A regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners proposed digging a tunnel beneath the Confederate defensive line, packing it with explosives, and detonating a gap large enough to break the siege in a single morning. Grant approved it. The miners dug for weeks through July heat, excavating a shaft 500 feet long, carrying out dirt in their hats and pockets to avoid detection. On July 30th, 1864, at 4:44 in the morning, the fuse reached 320 kegs of black powder. The explosion tore a crater approximately 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. It killed roughly 300 Confederate soldiers in a single instant. The defenders on either side of the gap scattered in shock and confusion. For 15 to 30 minutes, there was a breach in the Confederate line at Petersburg with almost nobody standing in it. The Union assault force charged into the crater. Not around it, into it. The division assigned to lead the assault, under General James Ledlie, poured into the pit itself. Ledlie, who was reportedly occupying a bomb-proof shelter with a bottle of rum while his men advanced, had not briefed his troops on the basic operational concept. Move past the crater, seize the ridge beyond it, and cut the Confederate line in two directions. The men who were supposed to exploit the gap instead stood in a 30-foot hole and had no clear idea what they were meant to do next. Confederate troops were covered within the half hour they had been granted. They concentrated fire from both lips of the crater, brought up artillery, and loaded it with canister rounds fired directly downward into the men trapped below. When General William Mahone counterattacked with fresh troops, the crater became a killing ground. The Union suffered nearly 3,800 casualties. The Petersburg line held. Grant later described it as the saddest affair he had witnessed in the entire war. The assault had every reasonable condition for success. It destroyed itself because the commander was absent and the troops he sent forward had not been told where to go. The final entry on this list came in October 1864, in the Shenandoah Valley, where Jubal Early's Confederate Army accomplished something most people believed was no longer possible. It surprised 3 Union corps in their camps at Cedar Creek and routed them before the sun was fully up. The attack had been planned with real care. Confederate General John Gordon spent days on a mountaintop scouting Union positions through a telescope, mapping the location of each corps. Early's men moved through the pre-dawn dark, crossed a ford the Union command had dismissed as impassable, and struck the Union left flank while men were still pulling on their boots. 3 corps broke and fled north along the Valley Pike. Phil Sheridan, the Union commander, was 19 miles away in Winchester, and he turned his horse south toward the sound of the guns. By mid-morning, Early held the field. He had captured 18 Union artillery pieces. He had pushed the Union army back several miles in a rout. The battle was, to all appearances, finished. Then his soldiers stopped to eat.
Early's Army of the Valley was a hungry army. Sheridan's earlier Shenandoah campaign had deliberately stripped the valley of supplies. Everything that could feed Confederate troops had been burned or carried off. When Early's men overran the Union camps, they found food, coffee, blankets, and equipment they hadn't seen in months. Men broke ranks. They ate breakfast in captured tents. Some of them tried on Union overcoats. The army that had won the battle dispersed for several hours into one large foraging party. Quiet incredulity. Sheridan reached the front around 10:30 in the morning. He rode the length of the retreating lines, and by early afternoon, he launched a counterattack against an enemy that was scattered across the landscape, many of them sitting down. Early's army, stuffed and disorganized, was driven back past its morning starting position and never truly recovered. What had been among the most stunning Confederate tactical achievements of the war became by nightfall a Union victory that effectively ended Confederate power in the Shenandoah Valley. Early had won before noon. He lost before dark because the army that had done the winning was hungry.
10 battles. 10 moments where the outcome turned on something other than numbers, strategy, or the relative quality of leadership. A scout who saw trees and called them tents. A general who turned a successful breakout back into a siege. An army that dissolved into a food raid in the middle of a victory they had already earned. These stories do not fit comfortably into the version of the Civil War that tends to appear in monuments and memorial addresses, the version where noble sacrifice and superior will determine who prevails. They belong to a different, messier tradition. The one that acknowledges war as a human enterprise, prone to all the failures and accidents that attend anything humans attempt at scale.
Genuine skill shaped the war, absolutely. Jackson's Valley campaign was real generalship. Grant's Vicksburg approach was operational thinking of the highest order. Sherman understood logistics and psychological pressure in ways that most of his contemporaries did not. But running alongside all of that competence was a parallel track, where battles ended because someone dropped a piece of paper, or panicked at the wrong moment, or let their soldiers eat when they should have been fighting. History does not always reward the side with the better plan. Sometimes it rewards the side that made one fewer catastrophic error on a given afternoon. The men fighting these engagements rarely had the full picture. They were working from incomplete maps, unreliable couriers, and the disorienting noise of a fight they could feel, but could not see. That so many of these battles were settled by factors no general could fully control is not a lesson in futility. It is simply a more honest accounting of what war has always been.